There was no phone buzz. No app to warn them of a cold front moving in. No weather lady pointing at swirling blue clouds on a glowing screen. Just silence. That's how it usually started. Not with a bang, but a hush. Out on the wide open plains, in the middle of what we now call nowhere, the first signs of winter came quietly. Trees stood still. The wind paused, just for a moment. And the sky, well, it turned the color of an old wool blanket. Soft gray. Thick. Heavy. The kind of sky that makes even the bravest cow look up and think, "Yep, something's coming." Our story begins in a little log cabin tucked between a stretch of hills and a skinny river that had long since frozen over. It's the late 1800s, somewhere in the middle of frontier America. No towns nearby. No neighbors within a day's ride. Just the sound of snow creaking under boots and the occasional groan of a pine tree leaning too far in the wind. Inside the cabin, a woman named Martha Bell stood by the window, watching her breath fog up the glass. She didn't need a thermometer to tell her what was going on. Her bones said it plain enough. Her husband, Jedediah, was outside, chopping wood like a man on a mission. That's how frontier men dealt with danger. They didn't run, they split it into firewood. Their kids, Elias and Rosie, were rolling up old quilts in the loft, trying to plug the holes in the walls. Rosie was 7. Elias, just 10. Old enough to know that cold on the frontier didn't knock politely. It barged in, uninvited. You see, in the frontier days, people had to read the land like a letter from an old friend. The way the horses breathed heavier. The way smoke from the chimney didn't rise but sank. The way the chickens suddenly got quiet. Even the dog, a big, shaggy mutt named Moses, had curled up early that day, nose tucked under his tail like he was trying to hide from what was coming. Out here, winter didn't wait. It showed up overnight. And once it came to stay. The Bell family wasn't rich. They had no coal stove, no stacks of canned soup, no electric heater to crank up when the wind howled. What they had were quilts made from old clothes, stew made from root vegetables and salted meat, and a whole lot of grit. The house itself was a log cabin built by Jed's own 2 hands, using nothing but an axe, some rope, and a lot of cussing. Every crack in the wall was stuffed with dried moss and mud. The floor was just packed dirt, swept clean with a broom made of twigs. Cozy? Kind of. Fancy? Not in the slightest. Still, it was home. And home is what you made it, especially when the cold came knocking. Now, this wasn't your everyday chilly weather. This was deep cold. The kind that froze water in the bucket before breakfast. The kind that made the door creak like an old man's knees. The kind that snuck into your boots, then your bones, and stayed there like an uninvited guest. Even inside the cabin, you could see your breath. Martha had taken to boiling water on the fire just to keep the air warm and steamy. She hung wet socks near the hearth, though they mostly turned to stiff little icicles before they dried. At night, the family all slept in one bed, yes, one bed, under a pile of blankets so heavy that once you were in, you weren't getting out without help. It wasn't cozy because it was charming. It was cozy because it was survival. They told stories to pass the time, tales of warmer days, silly jokes, and songs passed down from Grandma's kitchen. Jed liked to tell the same one about the time he tried to outrun a raccoon. Martha rolled her eyes every time, but the kids still laughed like it was brand new. Outside, the wind would whistle through the trees, brushing snow from the branches and piling it up against the door like the world was slowly being buried. You didn't go outside unless you had to. And when you did, you moved quick, did your business, and prayed your toes didn't turn purple. But even as the wind picked up and the snow drifted higher, there was a quiet kind of peace in it all. No buzzing lights. No noisy roads. Just the fire crackling, the snow falling, and the steady rhythm of survival. The Bell family wasn't alone in this. All across the frontier, families just like them were bracing for the same storm. Each with their own log homes. Their own frozen wells. Their own stack of split wood and homemade soup. Some lived further out, with not even a lantern in sight across the valley. Others had neighbors close enough to send smoke signals, or yell real loud. Everyone knew winter would come. They just didn't always know when. So when that hush fell over the land, when the birds stopped singing and even the cows looked nervous, folks paid attention. You learned to trust your gut, your animals, and the sky. And you learned that when winter came without warning, you didn't panic. You made another fire. You added another blanket. You told another story. Because out there, in the middle of nowhere, that was all you had. And somehow, it was enough. Before the wind ever blew its first snowflake across the prairie, frontier families had one job they took very seriously: building a home that could hold up to winter's worst. Now, when we say home, don't picture anything fancy. There were no picket fences. No wallpaper. No cozy upstairs bedrooms with lace curtains blowing in the breeze. No, sir. Out here, your home had one job: keep you alive. Let's go back to our frontier family, the Bells. Remember them? Jedediah, Martha, little Elias, and Rosie? Well, before they were curling up by the fire and telling raccoon stories, they were chopping logs, stacking stones, and packing mud. Jed built their home from scratch. Not because he wanted a rustic DIY project, but because there were no builders for miles, and even if there were, no money to pay them. He had an axe, a saw, a stubborn streak, and one good mule named Clover. He started by picking a good spot, close to water, some trees, and high ground, so rain and snow wouldn't flood them out. The cabin was small, just one room at first, but it was made to be strong. The walls were thick logs, stacked and notched together at the corners like puzzle pieces. Now, here's the trick most folks don't think about: logs shrink. They dry out. They settle. So if you didn't know what you were doing, you'd end up with a cabin that let in more wind than a broken barn door. That's why Jed stuffed every gap between logs with mud, moss, straw, or whatever else he could get his hands on. This homemade caulking was called chinking, and it was about as glamorous as it sounds. Martha helped, too. She hauled buckets of muddy slop, packed it into the cracks, and sometimes, when the cold had already started creeping in, froze her fingers doing it. She'd laugh later and say she chinked that cabin with love and frostbite. Now, not everyone lived in a log cabin. On the wide, flat plains where trees were harder to find than a politician's honesty, some families built sod homes, yes, actual houses made of dirt. They'd cut thick squares of prairie sod, roots and all, like giant blocks of brownies. These heavy chunks were stacked like bricks to form the walls. The roof? You guessed it, more sod, laid over wooden beams and covered with whatever scraps could hold the weight. These sod homes weren't exactly charming. When it rained, the roof sometimes leaked muddy water. In spring, grass might sprout from the ceiling. There were stories of snakes curling up in the walls and mice dropping from above. But when it came to winter, these dirt homes were insulated better than most log cabins. And the best part? They were cheap. Back at the Bell cabin, Jed had made one smart choice that helped every winter: the fireplace. It wasn't just for marshmallows and memories. It was the center of the home, a place for heat, light, cooking, and drying socks that never seemed to get dry. He built it from stone, using clay and ash as mortar. It sat in the center of the cabin's back wall, with a narrow chimney that kept smoke from curling back into the room. Martha insisted on a little shelf above it, just wide enough for a Bible, a lantern, and the tin mug Jed had carved their initials into. Now, one thing about building on the frontier: everything had to serve more than one purpose. The table was also a bed. The bench was also a chest. The ladder to the loft? That was also a drying rack, a back scratcher, and occasionally, a coat hanger. Even the walls weren't just walls. They were storage. Hooks held lanterns, tools, dried herbs, and, once, Elias's snow-soaked boots that never quite thawed before spring. Windows were rare. Glass was expensive and fragile. Most families used animal skin stretched tight over wood frames, or greased paper that let in a little light but kept the worst of the wind out. On the coldest nights, they'd cover the window with a board and a blanket, locking out what little light was left. The Bell family didn't build a palace, but they built something sturdy, sheltered, and most of all, theirs. The truth is, when you're out in the wilderness, home is what your hands make it. Each notch carved into a log. Each stone hauled from the river. Each muddy handprint in the chinking. All of it was a little act of hope. Hope that they'd survive the winter. Hope that the walls would hold. Hope that, come spring, they'd still be laughing inside these rough, hand-built walls. And you know what? They were. In every frontier cabin, there was one thing that mattered more than almost anything else: the fire. Without it, you froze. With it, you survived. Simple as that. It wasn't just heat, it was hope. Now, back in the Bell family's little log cabin, the fireplace wasn't just a decoration. It was the heart of the home. You could feel it the second you stepped inside. It sat against the far wall, a sturdy shape made of stone, blackened from years of smoke, and always busy doing something. If the fire was roaring, life was good. If the fire was low, things got tense. If the fire went out, well, someone had messed up bad. Keeping that fire going wasn't just cozy background noise like it is today, it was an around-the-clock job. Every morning started with it. Before anyone yawned or scratched their head or rubbed their eyes, someone, usually Jed, was already out of bed, barefoot on the cold floor, stirring up the coals from the night before. If the coals were still glowing, he could toss on a bit of kindling, maybe a small log, and boom, back in business. If the coals were cold, he had to start from scratch. Flint, steel, dried moss or bark, a whisper of breath, a whole lot of patience. Sometimes the whole cabin would hold its breath, just waiting for that first tiny flame to flicker up from the kindling. When it did, it was like magic. Not flashy, fireball in the sky magic. Just quiet, life-saving magic. Now, the bells weren't burning stacks of firewood for fun. Wood was precious. Jed and Elias had chopped and stacked every single log months before the snow came. That meant days of swinging axes, hauling wood, splitting kindling, and stacking it just right so it wouldn't rot or get soaked. Wood had to stay dry. A soggy log was about as helpful as a wet sock in a snowstorm. They built a little woodshed, not far from the cabin, covered with an old wagon tarp and roofed with leftover shingles. It was simple, but it did the job. Inside, wood was stacked in neat rows, thicker logs for overnight burns, slim sticks for kindling, and even tiny shavings for starting fires when the cold made your fingers too stiff to think straight. Martha kept a basket of wood right by the hearth. Not because it looked cute, but because you didn't want to step outside when the wind was howling like a pack of wolves. Speaking of wolves, sometimes they did howl. And that's when you really appreciated that fire. The fire gave light. It gave warmth. It kept bears, wolves, and frostbite at bay. But it also gave the family a rhythm. A little dance that kept them all connected. When Rosie saw the flames getting low, she'd run and grab more kindling. When Elias saw his dad nodding off in the chair, he'd poke the logs with the iron poker just right to make the fire crackle again. Even Martha, between cooking and sewing and storytelling, always had one eye on the flame. At night, after dinner, the family would all gather around the hearth. Not just to be warm, but because that's where everything happened. They ate by the fire. They read by the fire. They dried their boots, their socks, their mittens, even their eyelashes. Yes, eyelashes froze in those kinds of winters. Sometimes, they'd all just sit in silence, wrapped in quilts, watching the sparks float up the chimney and disappear into the dark. And when it was finally time for bed, Jed would bank the fire. That meant he'd rake the hot coals into a little pile, cover them with ashes, and let them smolder slow and quiet until morning. It was a gentle trick, passed down from his own pa, and it worked like a charm. If he did it right, there'd still be embers waiting in the morning. If not? Well, let's just say the next day started colder than it needed to. Not every family had a fireplace, though. Some had iron stoves, shipped in from back east. These were bulky black beasts that could heat a room in minutes, cook a stew in hours, and burn through a stack of wood faster than a hungry mule through hay. Stoves were safer, sure. No open flames. No sparks flying into the bedding. But they didn't have the same glow. The same charm. The same soul. At least, that's what Martha would have said. Still, the people who had stoves learned to love them too. You could warm your hands on the sides, boil a pot of beans on top, even dry herbs by hanging them from hooks along the flue. Fire tending wasn't just about tossing on wood and walking away. It was an art. You had to learn the language of the fire, the way it crackled when it needed more air, or smoked when the wood was too green, or danced just right when it was content. Sometimes Jed would sit back in his chair, watch the flames, and say, "She's a talkative one tonight." And the kids would giggle, like the fire was telling secrets just to them. In the darkest, deepest part of winter, that fire was their companion. Their warmth. Their protector. It reminded them they were still alive, still fighting, still together. Because on the frontier, you didn't survive winter by muscle alone. You survived by staying close to the fire, close to each other, and keeping the heart of the home beating, one glowing log at a time. When the cold really set in, and I mean the kind of cold that crept into your bones, the frontier family's biggest challenge wasn't just staying warm during the day, it was making it through the night. Because once the fire died down and the candles blew out, there was no thermostat to save you. Just the biting dark, the rattling wind, and whatever clever tricks you had up your sleeve. Now, the Bell family, like most folks on the frontier, knew how to turn bedtime into a full-on survival mission. No one just got into bed. Oh no. It was a whole routine. Let's start with the bed warmers. These little lifesavers looked like oversized frying pans with lids. You'd fill them with glowing coals from the hearth, carefully, mind you, then slide them back and forth between the bed sheets. It was kind of like giving the bed a warm hug before climbing in. And let me tell you, when the outside world was one giant icebox, slipping into a bed that didn't feel like a glacier, that was heaven. If the Bells were low on coals or trying to save firewood, they used heated stones instead. Rosie and her little brother Tom would run them into the fireplace until they were piping hot, then wrap them in old cloth or burlap and tuck them under the covers. Elias once called it stone soup for your feet. And honestly, not a bad description. But even with all that, staying warm wasn't easy. That's why most families slept together, sometimes in the same bed, sometimes just crammed into one room near the fire. Privacy? What's that? The Bell cabin had just one bedroom. Martha and Elias slept on the old rope bed, while the kids slept on straw mattresses, quilts, or whatever they could pile up near the hearth. Some nights, the little ones even curled up like puppies right on the floor, blankets stacked high, arms and legs tangled together. It might sound cramped, but when it's -20 outside, every bit of body heat counts. Even the dog slept indoors. In fact, if your toes were cold and you didn't mind a little dog breath, Old Scout made a great foot warmer. He'd snuggle in at the end of the bed, nose tucked under his tail, and not move till morning. Now, the quilts and blankets themselves were no joke. Martha made them from old clothes, leftover fabric, even flour sacks. Heavy, patchwork things, stitched with love and layered thick as armor. A proper winter bed had at least 3 or 4 of them, sometimes more. Climbing into one was like crawling under a barn door. But hey, it worked. Getting up, though? That was the real battle. Nobody wanted to leave the warmth of the bed in the morning. Especially not Rosie, who once claimed she could hear the frost whispering threats through the walls. So, Elias had a rule: whoever got up first made the fire. And funny enough, no one ever really raced to win that one. To ease the shock of the cold, folks would wrap themselves in blankets before getting up. They'd shuffle around like ghosts in quilts, stoking the fire, boiling water, or helping the kids bundle up before the real workday began. Even bedtime clothes were strategic. Everyone wore long woolen undergarments or slept in their day clothes. Sometimes, folks just didn't bother changing at all. If you were already wearing 6 layers, what was the point? Now and then, there were special sleep tricks passed down through the generations. Some swore by placing hot bricks at the foot of the bed. Others kept a kettle of water near the hearth, not to drink, but to check if it had frozen overnight, a silent little reminder of just how brutal winter could be. But even with all the clever hacks, some nights were just too cold. There'd be nights when the wind howled like wolves outside, rattling the shutters, sneaking under doors, and stealing warmth straight from the floorboards. On nights like those, no one slept deep. They just waited for morning. Still, there was comfort in the closeness. In the soft rise and fall of sleeping breath. In the tiny feet that found their way under your blanket sometime after midnight. In the crackling embers and the shadows dancing across the ceiling. And most of all, in knowing that while life on the frontier was hard, you weren't facing it alone. If you ever wondered what fashion looked like on the frontier, well, it wasn't about looking cute. It was about staying alive. The winter didn't care what you were wearing. The wind would bite right through a thin shirt like it wasn't even there. So, folks had to get smart, layer by layer. Let's start with the Bell family again. Elias Bell, our hard-working frontier father, always wore wool long johns under his trousers when the cold rolled in. Thick, scratchy, and older than some of his kids. He'd say, "Wool don't care how ugly it is. It's warm, and that's what matters." Over those, he'd wear cotton shirts, vests made of old fur, and a heavy coat that had probably been patched more times than it was stitched new. Martha had sewn it up so often, she could probably mend it with her eyes closed. Now Martha, she was all about layering smart. She didn't wear fancy underthings or corsets, not in that kind of cold. Nope. She wore long woolen shifts, with thick petticoats, aprons, and a shawl or 2 wrapped tight around her shoulders. Sometimes she'd even toss a quilted skirt over everything else. The goal was simple: trap the warmth in, and keep the frost out. And for little Rosie and Tom? They looked like walking bundles of laundry half the time. Mittens that didn't match. Scarves twice their size. 3 shirts, 2 pairs of socks, and a hat that made their heads look like giant turnips. But they were warm, and that's what counted. Everyone in the house had at least one good pair of boots, usually leather, lined with wool or stuffed with straw. And if they didn't have boots, they made do with old shoes wrapped in rags or stuffed into oversized socks. On the frontier, you didn't throw things away. A coat with holes became a vest. A torn dress became a pillowcase. Even the wool from worn-out socks might be unraveled and reused. Undergarments were worn like armor. Especially at night. And remember, changing clothes wasn't something folks did daily. Especially not in winter. If you had 2 sets of warm things, you were doing all right. Most people had one, and they prayed it stayed dry. Which brings us to the real struggle: wet clothes. Getting wet in freezing weather wasn't just miserable, it could be dangerous. Hypothermia didn't care how tough you were. So families tried to stay dry as much as possible. But when clothes did get soaked, from snow, slush, or spilled water, drying them was its own mission. There were no dryers, no radiators. Just the fireplace, and if you were lucky, a drying rack. At the Bell cabin, Martha had a line stretched across the hearth. She'd hang socks, mittens, and scarves over it after wringing them out, praying they'd dry before the next outing. Sometimes, the heat would dry them too fast, and they'd shrink or stiffen like boards. But that was still better than putting on frozen clothes the next morning. Elias even rigged up a wooden rack near the ceiling once, the warmest spot in the house, just to dry Tom's boots faster. Worked like a charm. Mostly. And let's not forget head coverings. The Bell family believed firmly that if your head was warm, the rest of you could follow. So hats were everywhere, knit caps, fur-trimmed bonnets, even old handkerchiefs tied tight. Even indoors, it wasn't uncommon to see someone with a cap on. Warmth over fashion. Always. And if you're wondering whether they ever got too hot? Not really. In fact, the real trick was knowing what not to take off. Because once that cold crept back in, you might not warm up again for hours. Layering wasn't just about adding clothes. It was about understanding how to trap body heat, how to protect the most vulnerable parts, hands, feet, ears, and how to prepare for the worst, even if the day started out sunny. Sometimes, the wind would change mid-afternoon and bring a storm with it. If you weren't dressed for it, you'd pay the price fast. Rosie learned that one winter when she insisted on running outside in just her dress and a shawl. She was back in 5 minutes, red-faced and shivering, hugging Scout the dog just to feel her fingers again. She never forgot her mittens after that. Now here's something sweet. Martha used to tuck hot stones into the kids' boots before they put them on in the morning. Just for a moment of comfort. It didn't last long, but it was one of those little gestures that made the cold feel a little less cruel. So when you think of frontier families and what they wore, don't picture stiff uniforms or perfectly matching outfits. Think layers, patches, and practical love stitched into every thread. Because every scarf had a story. Every hole had a history. And every layer meant survival. Winter on the frontier didn't just test your warmth, it tested your will to eat. Once the food stores started running low, and they always did, there was only one option left: go out and find more. But this wasn't like running to the store. No one was grabbing a basket and picking up eggs and bacon. No, this was the real stuff. Cold fingers, deep snow, and a long walk with no promise of return. Let's drop back into the Bell family again. It's late January now. The wind is howling like a pack of wolves across the prairie. Elias Bell, the father, pulls on his thickest coat, a fur-lined cap, and a pair of worn leather gloves. The pantry is nearly empty, and supper was thin last night, just a little broth and some potatoes. Rosie and Tom don't complain. But their eyes linger on the pot longer than usual. Elias shoulders his rifle, nods to his wife, and heads out. Paw prints tracking in the snow. The snow is deep. With every step, Elias sinks nearly to his knees. He follows the tree line, searching for rabbit tracks, tiny indents in the powdery white. If he's lucky, he'll find a few still lingering near the brambles. Sometimes he sets simple snares, loops of wire or twine tucked into little tunnels where rabbits like to run. He might return in a few hours, hoping for movement or signs of struggle. Farther out, he sometimes spots deer tracks, long, graceful imprints weaving through the snow. But chasing a deer in winter was a gamble. You had to track it for hours, sometimes days. You needed luck, patience, and a little prayer. If you managed to bring one down, that was meat for a month, maybe more. But if not, well, you still had to walk all the way home in the cold with nothing to show for it but numb toes. Fish and hook fishing beneath the ice. Sometimes, Elias didn't hunt on land. About a mile from the cabin was a frozen creek, thick with ice and silence. He'd pack a chisel and a short pole, trudge out to the middle, and chip through the ice until the dark, frigid water shimmered below. Then came the waiting. Ice fishing was a test of stillness. You Saturday. You shivered. You waited. But when a line tugged, when the pole bent, the joy of pulling up a fat trout or perch was almost enough to warm your whole body. Almost. Chipmunk hashed the art of foraging in snow. Martha Bell didn't stay idle, either. While Elias hunted, she might wrap herself in layers, tuck little Rosie beside her, and head into the woods. Under the snow, beneath the trees, wild herbs still clung to life. Sage, juniper berries, and the dried husks of rose hips were worth finding. Sometimes they dug for buried nuts, or broke off pieces of tree bark to boil into bitter, warming teas. Not delicious. But it kept bellies full and spirits up. She always brought a little canvas bag. Some days it came back empty. Other days, it held the day's small victory. Snowflake hash traveling in a blizzard. Now, here's the hard part. Sometimes, survival meant going even farther. Past your land. Past the woods. Maybe to another family's homestead, if you knew they had food to spare. Or to check traps laid out miles from home. But traveling in a blizzard? That could be deadly. The snow turned trails invisible. Landmarks vanished. You couldn't tell the ground from the sky. A man could walk in circles for hours and never know it, until the cold took hold. There were stories. A cousin lost just 3 miles from home, buried under snow and never found until spring. A boy who went looking for firewood and nearly didn't return. Folks tied ropes from the door to the barn just to make sure they could find their way back. Survival wasn't just about toughness. It was about knowing when not to push your luck. Elias once turned back from a hunt empty-handed. Not because he wanted to, but because the wind was screaming, and the sky turned white, and something in his gut said, not today. That choice saved his life. Wolf face what you risk to eat. Every time someone left the cabin, they took a chance. Frostbite? Thin ice. Wild animals. Getting lost. A broken leg with no one around to help. But not going out? That came with its own risk. So frontier families walked that line every single day. They made traps from scrap wire. They used bows and arrows when they didn't have bullets. They watched for signs, claw marks, feathers, gnawed bark. Even kids helped. Little Tom might have to check traps before breakfast. Rosie would keep the fire warm so her dad had something hot to come back to. Place setting hashed the taste of success. When a hunt went well, the whole house celebrated. A rabbit on the table meant stew for 3 nights. A big fish meant fried fillets, crisp and hot beside cornbread. Even a handful of nuts or dried herbs lifted spirits. And when Elias walked in, cheeks red and breath heavy, with something wrapped in cloth or hanging from his belt, Rose's eyes lit up like lanterns. Tom ran to help. Martha gave a tired but proud smile. Because that catch, however small, meant another day of warmth, of fullness, of hope. Out there in the frozen wild, every step could be the one that saved you, or the one you didn't come back from. But still, they went. Because when your family's hungry, when you're surrounded by cold and silence, even the smallest victory is worth the risk. And on the frontier, winter didn't hand out victories. You had to go out and earn them. Winter on the frontier didn't just test your warmth, it tested your will to eat. You twist a knob, once the food stores started running low, and clear, and they always did. Now picture there was only one option left, the wind's howling, find more. Snow's drifting up the door, this wasn't like running to the store. Running water. No one was grabbing a basket and picking up eggs and bacon. Just ice, snow, this was the real stuff. Out on the frontier, cold fingers, getting water in winter was a struggle most folks today can hardly imagine. Let's drop back into the Bell family. It's late January now. Early in their first winter, the wind is howling like a pack of wolves across the prairie. Enough. Elias dug it deep over the summer. Pulls on his thickest coat, was clear and firelight cap, perfect and for cooking and drinking leather gloves. But winter didn't care about your hard work, and supper was thin last night. The top just a little feet of the well frozen into solid ice. Rosie and Tom don't complain with a shovel, but their eyes linger on the pot longer than usual. All he got was tired hands and frustration. His rifle. Eventually, his wife, he had to admit out. The well was useless for now. In the snow. Water would have to come from somewhere else. With every step, the simplest answer sinks nearly to his knees. The frontier follows the tree line, searching for rabbit most folks don't realize. Snow is mostly air. If it takes a lot of snow to make a little bit of water near the brambles. One heaping bucket of snow melted down might give you a few inches of wire or twine tucked into little tunnels, so the bells made it a routine. Every morning, in a few hours, or young Tom trudged out with a tin bucket of struggle, scooped up the cleanest snow they could find, sometimes fresh deer tracks, not the trampled or yellow kind, and carried it back inside. But chasing a deer in winter was a gamble. Slowly turning, you had to track it for hours. Martha would stir the pot to help it along. You needed luck, then strain it through cloth and a little prayer. Grit. If you managed to bring one down, but it worked. That was meat for a month. Sometimes they got creative. But if on especially cold days, you still had to walk all the way home in the cold with chunks of frozen creek ice instead. They cracked the ice using a hammer or wedge, haul it back, and drop it in the pot on land. It melted about a mile from the cabin was a frozen creek. To speed things up, Martha would heat smooth river rocks and a short pole, then carefully drop them into the pot and chip through the ice until the dark, frigid water made the whole cabin smell like earth and warmth. Ice fishing was a test of stillness. Some families were lucky enough to live near a natural spring, a water source that ran even in winter. When the pole bent, the bells weren't that lucky. The joy of pulling up a fat trout or perch was almost enough to warm your whole body. In a low hollow. Almost. It rarely froze solid. Hashed the art of foraging in snow. Elias would carry 2 heavy pails out and fill them from the icy Elias hunted. She might wrap herself in layers. Cold wind cut little Rosie beside her. The slope down to the spring was slick, and one wrong step could send him tumbling. Wild herbs still clung to life. That was liquid gold, juniper berries, and the dried husks of rose hips were worth finding. Here's the scary part. Sometimes they dug for buried nuts or broke off pieces of tree bark to boil into bitter. But dehydration was a real danger. Not delicious in cold weather, but it kept bellies full and spirits thirsty. She always brought a little canvas bag. But between the dry air, would smoke, other hard labor, it held they were sweating and breathing out moisture all day long. Traveling in a blizzard. Not drinking enough led to headaches, the hard weakness, and sometimes in the worst survival meant going even farther. And out in the cold, land, confusion could mean getting lost, maybe to another family's homestead. So Martha kept an eye on the kids, they had food to making sure Rosie and Tom traps laid out miles from home throughout the day. But traveling in a blizzard, thirsty or not, that could be deadly. Snow might look clean, but out on the plains, you had to be careful. Vanished. Animals roamed freely. You couldn't tell the ground from the sky. So did smoke and ash. A man could walk in circles for hours and frost
never
that
know
snowdrift
until the cold
That's why the
took hold.
bells always
There
boiled
were
their
stories.
water every time.
A cousin lost
no
just
matter
3
what.
miles from home.
It became
buried under
nature,
snow and never
melt,
found until
strain,
spring.
boil,
A boy who went looking
cool,
for firewood
drink.
and nearly didn't
Sometimes,
return. Martha
folks
added
tied
mint
ropes
leaves
from
or
the drawer
dried
to the
berries
barn
to the
just
pot
to make sure
it
they
more
could
pleasant.
find their way back.
Just a little something
Survival
to remind
wasn't
them
just
there was
about
more to
toughness.
life than just
It was
surviving.
about knowing when
Water
not to push
wasn't
your
just
luck.
for drinking.
Elias
They
once
needed
turned
it for
back from a
cooking,
hunt
empty-handed,
and sometimes
not because
even
he
medicine.
wanted to. So they
But because
stretched
the
every
wind was
drop.
screaming,
Washing
and the sky
dishes,
turned white,
one pot
and
of
something
water
in his gut said,
reused until
not
it
today.
turned grey.
That choice
Bathing,
saved his life.
a shared basin,
Wolf face
warmed
what you
by the
risk to
fire,
eat.
and quick
Every
scrubs
time
only.
someone left the
Hair
cabin,
washing,
they took a chance.
maybe once a week,
Frostbite,
thin
every
ice.
time they dumped
Wild
water
animals,
outside, Martha
getting
would watch
lost,
it freeze on the
a
spot.
broken leg with
a
no one
reminder of
around
how
to
precious
help.
it was.
But not going
Tom
out,
once knocked
that
over a
came
full
with its own
bucket.
risk.
Martha
So
didn't
frontier
scold
families
him,
walked
but her
that line
silence
every
stung
single
more than
day.
any words.
They made traps
From
from
then
scrap
on,
wire.
he carried it with
They
both
used bows
hands.
and arrows when
At
they
night,
didn't have
they'd
bullets.
save a little warm
They watched
water
for
in a
signs,
kettle.
claw
Not
marks,
for chores,
feathers,
but for
nor
comfort.
bark. Just
Even
before
kids
bed,
helped.
Elias poured
Little
a bit
Tom
into
might
a tin
have to
cup
check
for
traps
Martha.
before breakfast.
She wrapped her hands
Rosie
around
would
it,
keep the
breathing
fire
in the
warm,
steam.
so her dad had something
Sometimes
hot to
she'd
come
pass
back
it to
to.
Rosie or
Place
Tom.
setting the
They'd
taste
taste
of
slow,
success.
eyes heavy.
When a
It
hunt
wasn't
went well,
much. The
but
whole
in a world
house
of cold and
celebrated.
scarcity,
A rabbit
that
on the
small
table
act,
meant stew
warmth
for 3
shared,
nights.
was everything.
A big fish
Water
meant
in
fried
winter
fillets,
wasn't a given.
crisp and hot beside
It was a daily
cornbread.
battle.
Even a
But the
handful
bells
of
fought
nuts
it like
or
they
dried
did everything
herbs
else,
lifted spirits.
with care, with
And
patience,
when Elias
and
walked
with
in,
quiet
cheeks
strength,
red and breath heavy,
even in the deepest
with something
cold,
wrapped in
they made
cloth
it
or
flow.
hanging from his belt. Rose's eyes lit up like lanterns. Tom ran to help. Martha gave a tired but proud smile. Because that catch, however small, meant another day of warmth, of fullness, of hope. Out there in the frozen wild, every step could be the one that saved you, or the one you didn't come back from. But still, they went. Because when your family's hungry, when you're surrounded by cold and silence, even the smallest victory is worth the risk. And on the frontier, winter didn't hand out victories. You had to go out and earn them. Illness had its own shadow in a frontier home, and when the cold crept in, so too did the fear. With no doctor nearby, families learned to face the worst with nothing but what they had at hand, and each other. Frostbite didn't always come with warning. Sometimes it started as a sting on the fingertips while chopping wood, a numbness in the toes after walking through a snowfield. But by the time the fire was warm and boots were off, skin might already be grey, the pain setting in like fire under ice. There were no emergency rooms, no heated ambulances, just the simple hope that someone in the family knew enough to save a finger, a toe, or a life. They used warm, not hot, water to bring frozen limbs back slowly. Too fast and it hurt worse. They wrapped hands and feet in cloth warmed by the hearth, whispered prayers under their breath, and waited. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Pneumonia was another silent predator. A child could be laughing one day and coughing through the night the next, cheeks red with fever. Without antibiotics, folks leaned on what nature offered. Onion poultices pressed against the chest, steam from boiling herbs, and lots of hot broth. Garlic was used, and sometimes honey mixed with bits of pine sap. These weren't cures, not really. But they helped. They gave the body a fighting chance. Childbirth in winter was its own test of faith and endurance. A midwife might live miles away, and snow could make the journey impossible. So mothers labored by firelight with their own mothers, sisters, or daughters holding their hands. Towels were warmed, water boiled, and clean cloth was laid out on the table or bed. They kept things quiet, calm, focused. Pain was expected. So was risk. But new life came anyway, and when that first cry filled the room, it was like the sun breaking through a week of clouds. Not all stories ended in joy. A slip on ice while carrying water could mean a broken arm. A cut from an axe while splitting logs could turn bad fast if it got infected. There were no clean bandages unless someone had taken time to boil cloth or sew linen ahead of time. Wounds were cleaned with whiskey or salt water, wrapped tightly, and then watched. Redness, swelling, signs of infection. That was when the old remedies came out. Poultices made of chewed herbs, ash, or mashed roots. People believed in the healing power of yarrow, comfrey, and plantain. Some said spider webs helped stop bleeding. Others used honey, thick and golden, as a wound dressing. It wasn't just the body they tried to heal. When someone got sick or injured, the whole house felt it. Firewood had to be chopped, animals fed, meals cooked. Children stepped up to help. Neighbors came if the snow let them. But often, it was just the family pulling together, everyone doing more with less sleep and more worry. And still, they kept hope alive. There were stories, passed down like heirlooms, of impossible recoveries. A man who survived a week-long fever after being snowed in. A baby-born breech who grew up strong. A woman who walked barefoot through snow to get help for her husband after a fall. These stories mattered. They gave people something to hold on to when all they could do was wait. Prayer was part of every remedy. When there were no answers, no science to lean on, faith stepped in. Psalms were read aloud at bedsides. Hands were held. Candles lit.
In quiet rooms where breath came ragged and sleep was fitful, voices rose in whispers, asking, pleading, hoping. Not every prayer was answered. But some were. And that was enough to keep the next one going. Loss, when it came, was a part of life, though no less heavy for its familiarity. The family would gather around the one who passed, holding each other through the silence. A simple wooden coffin. A burial in the frozen ground. A few words spoken with eyes full of tears and cheeks stung by wind. Life would go on. It had to. But resilience, now that was stitched into every soul that endured those winters. To survive the coldest nights with no doctor, no medicine, and no help but what you made with your hands and your heart, that was its own kind of strength. And it didn't just live in the muscles or bones. It lived in the way they loved one another. The way they kept trying, kept hoping, and kept going. Even when the wind howled and the fire burned low. Even when the world outside turned white and quiet and cold. The people inside those cabins kept living, kept healing, and kept believing that spring would come. When the storms rolled in and the snow blanketed the world outside, frontier families turned inward. Life slowed down in the winter. There were no fields to tend or crops to harvest. Instead, there was time. Time to sit. Time to mend. Time to be with one another in the hush of the season. But even in stillness, the hands stayed busy. Inside the log cabin, the fire crackled low, throwing orange light across rough-hewn walls. The rhythm of a rocking chair creaked softly, the thump of a wooden needle through thick cloth a quiet heartbeat in the room. Mothers mended clothes by lantern glow, stitching worn-out socks or patching elbows on wool coats. The children watched, sometimes helping, sometimes just sitting near for the warmth. Threads and thimbles, needles and scraps, these were the tools of quiet evenings. Whittling was another way the time was passed. Men and boys carved shapes from wood, spoons, toys, sometimes just smooth sticks whittled down for the sake of doing. It wasn't always about usefulness. Sometimes it was just about staying still and doing something with your hands while your mind wandered or listened to a story. And stories, those were never in short supply. Every home had its favorites. Tales passed down from grandparents, retold every winter. Sometimes true, sometimes tall. Ghost stories, Bible stories, funny stories about a cow that once escaped into the woods and wasn't found for 2 days. Stories kept the cold at bay, gave the mind something to chew on besides the weather. The best ones always came after supper, when the chores were done and everyone was wrapped in quilts, bellies full, and the fire warm. Books were treasures. If a family had a Bible, it was read often. Some families had old almanacs or a single book of poems. Children learned to read by firelight, spelling out words slowly with their fingers tracing the letters. And when the reading was done, the book was carefully tucked away again, pages dry and safe from the damp air. Little ones played with handmade toys. Dolls sewn from scraps of fabric, corncob figures, wooden animals. Not many, but enough. Games were made up too, a pebble toss, a word game, a hand clap rhyme passed from sibling to sibling. Laughter echoed in cabins, just like in any home, though it was quieter, softer somehow. Like the snow outside muted even joy. Some kept journals. Scraps of paper bound together or stitched into old cloth covers. A mother might record the day's events, Jacob's cough worse today, or boiled dandelion tea for Sarah's headache. A father might write about the snowfall or how many logs were stacked. These journals weren't fancy, but they held life inside them, tiny time capsules of the coldest months. Evenings had their own rituals. The fire was banked just right to last the night. Water was brought in to thaw by the hearth. The baby was tucked close between parents, and older children curled up together under the heaviest quilts. Prayers were said aloud, sometimes sung. A hymn hummed low, the kind that made the air feel sacred. And when silence came, that true silence of a world covered in snow, it wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. A moment to breathe, to think, to watch the flicker of flame on a log and feel, for once, like there was nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. Sometimes there were visits. A neighbor might stop by, shaking snow from their shoulders, cheeks pink from the wind. They'd stomp their boots, hang their coat, and be handed a mug of something warm. And then the talking began. News exchanged, recipes shared, a joke or two, and then a slow parting back into the snow. Those visits were gold, rare and treasured. Other times, it was just family. Just the same faces day in and day out, learning each other deeply. Learning patience. Learning how to live in close quarters without too many words. Learning to listen. In those long, quiet months, character was carved as surely as the wooden toys by the fire. Children grew thoughtful. Adults grew reflective. No one wasted time, even rest had purpose. Winter indoors wasn't just about surviving. It was about holding on to the heart of life when everything outside was still and white. Inside, there was color. The red of apples stored away. The brown of worn boots drying by the fire. The yellow flicker of flame. and the human voices that rose in soft, steady rhythm, telling, teaching, laughing, remembering. And though it might have seemed like not much was happening, those quiet moments built something strong. A closeness that couldn't be shaken by storms. A steadiness that held when the wind roared. And a warmth that lasted long after the snow melted and the doors opened again to spring. When the winds howled outside and snow piled high against the cabin walls, the real warmth came not just from firewood, but from the stories, songs, and spirit that filled the home. Life indoors during the coldest months wasn't just about surviving, it was about staying whole in heart and mind. And nothing brought people closer than the flicker of firelight, the comfort of shared beliefs, and the whispers of old folklore passed from generation to generation. Evening came early in winter. By late afternoon, the sky dimmed and lamps were lit. A single candle might light the center of a wooden table, or a small oil lamp might glow near the hearth. As the room settled into shadows, someone would always speak first. Sometimes a reading from the family Bible. Other times, a quiet story that began with, "Your grandpa used to say." Faith was stitched into everyday life on the frontier, and winter only made it stronger. It wasn't just about church services, many families were too far from any church to attend regularly. It was about the daily rituals. A prayer said before the morning chores. Another whispered before sleep. And during a storm, when the winds threatened the roof and cold crept through the cracks, it was faith that kept fear from settling too deep. Children sat close to their parents, not just for warmth, but to listen. They learned the same stories their grandparents once heard, tales of saints, miracles, and warnings wrapped in old folk sayings. If you hear the wind call your name, don't answer. Never leave your boots upside down or the spirits might fill them. Some of it was superstition. Some of it was just a way to explain what they didn't understand. But all of it mattered. It gave meaning to long nights and mystery to the world beyond the cabin walls. There were songs, too. Soft and slow. Sung in rounds or as lullabies to restless little ones. Some were hymns passed down through memory, some were made up on the spot. And while no one had formal training, the voices blended in a way that felt like home. The sound of a father's hum, a mother's quiet harmony, a child adding a verse, these became the music of survival. Firelight was more than heat. It was a companion. People sat and stared into it like it held all the answers. Flames flickered against the log walls, casting shapes that danced and shimmered. Sometimes someone would point to a shadow and say, "That looks like a horse," or, "Do you see the old man's face?" It sparked laughter, or silence, or dreams. When there were no more chores to do, no more food to cook, and no more wood to split, the fire became the center of their world. It brought peace. It brought reflection. Sometimes someone would say a quiet thought aloud, about someone they missed, or a lesson they learned, or a hope for the spring. And the others would nod, not needing to say anything back. Books were rare, but treasured. A single novel might be read aloud night after night, the words becoming as familiar as a family member. Pages were turned with care. Stories paused mid-chapter and resumed the next day. Even scripture was read like a tale, with heroes, battles, trials, and hope. And when no book was around, the stories came from memory. They weren't always happy tales. Sometimes they were about hardship, strange happenings, or the kind of loss that left everyone quiet. But these stories helped. They reminded everyone that what they felt wasn't new. That others had been cold, scared, tired, and hopeful too. That others had survived. Sometimes neighbors would visit, if weather allowed. They'd bring news or a loaf of bread, or just stay for a while to warm up and share a pipe. These moments felt like celebrations. The house felt fuller, voices louder, laughter more frequent. And when the guests left, they were sent off with a bit of food, a few blessings, and always the same line, "Be safe out there." Even in the stillness, life inside those log walls was rich. With faith guiding their hearts, and stories keeping their spirits strong, families learned how to endure more than just the cold. They carried traditions, whispered old words, and found peace in the patterns of winter nights. And so, by firelight, in a room filled with breath and warmth and memory, the frontier family endured. Through faith. Through folklore. Through the quiet magic of a story well told. The cold months didn't pause for anyone, and for the women on the frontier, there was never truly a moment to rest. Winter tested everyone, but it especially pressed on the shoulders of mothers, daughters, grandmothers, and wives. Their strength wasn't just in the work they did, it was in the way they held a home together when everything outside threatened to tear it apart. A frontier woman might rise before the sun, her breath visible in the cold air as she stoked the hearth back to life. She'd check the coals from the night before, add kindling with careful hands, and coax the fire to crackle once more. That fire meant breakfast. It meant warmth. It meant survival. She knew the sounds of the house. The groans in the logs, the shifting winds, the cough of a child still asleep under quilts. While others slept, she worked. Water had to be warmed. Bread had to be started. She might knead dough with fingers still red from the cold, humming softly so as not to wake anyone too soon. There was always mending to do. Woolen socks that needed darning, mittens that had worn thin, shirts missing buttons. She sat near the firelight with her sewing box, repairing what little they had so it would last another week, another storm, another winter. But she was more than the keeper of clothing and cook fires. She was the family's nurse, teacher, and guide. When someone was ill, it was often her hands that wiped fevered brows and stirred herbal remedies into warm cups. When there were disputes among children, it was her voice that settled the storm. And when things grew too quiet, too still, she reminded everyone that silence was not emptiness. It was peace. Sometimes she read to the family. Other times she listened as her husband read scripture or told stories by lamplight. But even then, her fingers rarely rested. She knitted while listening, eyes watching the flames, ears tuned to the words. Her mind always half in the moment, half on what came next. Teaching didn't stop in winter. While schoolhouses might close when snow blocked the paths, education continued at home. She taught her children to read and write with what little paper they had, to memorize Bible verses, to count beans for math. Learning wasn't fancy, but it was steady. And then there were the moments that didn't make noise, the quiet courage of childbirth in the dead of winter. The silent weeping when food ran low. The way she smiled anyway, just to keep hope alive in the eyes of her children. She bore the cold like everyone else, but she bore so much more. Loneliness. Fear. The never-ending pressure to hold everything together when the winds outside howled like wolves and the woodpile shrank too fast. And yet, she stood firm. Because she had to. Take, for instance, a young woman named Clara. Only 19, but already a mother of 2, with a third on the way. Her husband was away hunting, and a storm rolled in faster than expected. With wind rattling the shutters and snow blocking the door, Clara kept the fire alive, boiled snow for water, and calmed a crying baby with a song her own mother had once sung. When her son grew ill with fever, she brewed tea from dried elderflowers and wrapped him in every blanket they had. She stayed awake for 2 nights, whispering prayers through cracked lips until the fever broke. That wasn't heroism to Clara. It was just life. But that's the thing about frontier women, they didn't always see their own strength, even when they were made of it. They were the quiet anchors in the wild wind. The steady hands in a trembling world. And their stories, though often untold, were the backbone of every warm cabin and every survival tale. When spring finally began to melt the world outside, you could see it on their faces. Relief, yes. But also a kind of earned pride. They had done it. Again. Held the family together. Kept the light burning. Carried the weight of winter with grace. And they'd do it again, without complaint. Because love, real, enduring, frontier love, was stitched into everything they touched. Winter was a teacher, and children on the frontier were its students whether they liked it or not. There were no snow days off when survival was on the line. Cold weather didn't stop chores, and it didn't make much room for play. But somehow, frontier kids still managed to learn, grow, and even find joy between the hard edges of winter. A child's day started early, long before the sun had touched the frozen horizon. They'd crawl out from under thick quilts, breath puffing like little clouds in the cold morning air. There were no pajamas, just layers of wool and linen, hand-me-downs patched and repatched until they hardly resembled the original garment. First came fire duty. If they were old enough, they'd be sent to check the hearth, stir the coals, or bring in more kindling from the lean-to. If they were still small, they might run to the woodpile with arms barely able to carry a log, grinning proudly the whole way. Helping with the fire made them feel useful, and they were. Breakfast didn't cook itself. Older children helped stir porridge or grind cornmeal. If there were animals, someone had to break through the frozen crust of the water trough, scatter feed for the chickens, or milk the cow with hands that moved fast to keep warm. Frost nipped at noses and toes, but the work got done. It had to. Frontier kids learned early not to complain. There wasn't time for it. Instead, they learned to take pride in being needed. Fetching water from a frozen stream or snow-melting pot wasn't just a task, it was a sign you were growing up. Being trusted with the axe to chop kindling? That was almost a badge of honor. But winter wasn't all chores and frostbitten fingers. There were pockets of play. Children would press their faces to icy windows, watching snow fall like feathers from the sky. If the wind wasn't too fierce, they might go out to build snow forts, toss snowballs, or make trails through the drifts just to see who could go farther without sinking. They made sleds from wooden planks or used big cooking pans to slide down hills. Laughter echoed across the white fields, sometimes so loud it scared the birds from the trees. For a little while, they could forget the cold, the chores, the grown-up weight of survival. Evenings were different. That's when everything slowed. Families gathered close by the fire. Children huddled under quilts, listening to stories passed down through generations. Tales of wolves and wandering spirits, brave settlers and kind-hearted strangers. Sometimes they'd beg for the same story night after night, mouths open in awe, eyes wide as the wind whistled outside. Some children learned to whittle wood into tiny animals or people. Others learned to sew simple stitches, practicing on scrap cloth while their mothers mended real clothes nearby. Boys might carve toy rifles or shape arrowheads from stone. Girls braided yarn into dolls or helped churn butter with tired but willing arms. Education didn't end with chores. If the family had books, and many did, even if only the Bible, reading was sacred. Mothers taught letters by candlelight. Fathers quizzed children on verses and stories. Even if they didn't go to a formal school in winter, children learned plenty: how to listen, how to watch, how to understand the way the world worked. Winter shaped their character. It taught them patience, waiting for a thaw, for the storm to pass, for the sun to return. It taught them courage, to go out into the snow to check on a trapped animal, or to carry soup to a sick neighbor. It taught them responsibility, because even the youngest had a part to play in keeping everyone safe and warm. Of course, there were hard moments. Nights when the cold crept in too deep, and little hands trembled under the covers. Mornings when a favorite lamb didn't survive the storm. Times when a sibling got sick and the whole cabin fell quiet with worry. These moments marked them, but they also made them. And still, they found wonder in the world. The sparkle of frost on the window. The crunch of snow underfoot. The taste of fresh bread pulled from a Dutch oven. The way their mother's voice wrapped around them like a blanket when she sang softly to hush their fears. Winter was hard. But children on the frontier didn't just endure it, they grew strong because of it. They learned to find light in the darkest months, warmth in the coldest hours, and joy in the simplest things. And when spring finally came, they burst outside barefoot and wild, like seeds finally freed from the frost. Ready for another year. Ready to remember what the cold taught them, and carry it with them forever. Blizzards didn't knock on the door. They didn't give much warning at all. One minute, the sky might be grey and calm, and the next, the wind howled like it had a bone to pick with the earth itself. Snow swirled so thick you couldn't see the hand in front of your face. And when that happened on the frontier, lives could change in minutes. There are stories, real and passed down, of families nearly lost in the whiteout. And they all start the same way: someone had to go out. Maybe it was a trip to the barn to check on livestock. Maybe a neighbor was sick and needed help. Maybe they were just coming back from town, wagon wheels squeaking on frozen trails. Then, the storm rolled in. You didn't travel in a blizzard unless it was life or death, and even then, you might not make it. People got turned around just steps from their own door. The wind was loud, wild, and disorienting. Snow fell sideways, sometimes up, and once you were caught in it, direction didn't mean much. It was all white. That's why some families tied ropes from the back door to the barn. It sounds strange now, but when the wind's screaming and snow blinds you, that rope might be the only thing guiding you home. Hands followed it like a lifeline. Without it, you could get lost just walking 20 yards. One story told around fires was of a boy named Eli. He went out to chop wood before supper, just as the first flakes started falling. His mother warned him not to be long. But within minutes, the storm swallowed the yard. The family waited by the door, calling his name into the storm. No answer. Hours passed. Then finally, just before midnight, he stumbled in, half frozen, eyes wide, still gripping the axe. He'd found the wall of the house by pure luck. That night, they tied up a rope. Then there were the stories that ended harder. A father who left to check a trapline and never returned. A neighbor woman found curled under a pine tree days later, arms wrapped around herself, just a mile from home. The cold didn't forgive mistakes. But not all was tragedy. The frontier had its heroes too. There's the tale of Mary Jane, a young girl barely 12. Her pa had gone out during a calm spell to fetch help for her sick baby brother, but the snow came faster than expected. Mary kept the fire burning, rationed the food, and sang lullabies to her baby brother as the wind shook the shutters. For 3 days, they were snowed in. When her father finally returned, the baby was warm, the fire still going, and Mary, tired but strong, just said, "We're all right, Pa." Survival in a blizzard took more than luck. It took instinct, preparation, and grit. Families learned to listen to the weather, to spot the signs, the way birds disappeared, how the wind shifted, the eerie hush before the storm. When those signs came, chores got done faster. Extra firewood was brought in. Food was set near the hearth. Water jugs filled. Doors latched. Curtains closed tight. Inside, while the world outside vanished under white and wind, families huddled together. They read scripture aloud, told stories, and sometimes just listened to the storm. The walls might creak. Snow might pile high enough to block the light. But as long as the fire burned, hope lived. Sometimes, neighbors became saviors. A man might harness his horse, wrap himself in fur, and push into the storm to bring medicine to a sick friend. Another might lead lost travelers by lantern light back to his cabin. These acts of bravery weren't rare, they were expected. Because on the frontier, someone else's survival was often tied to your own. The snow could fall for days, and when it finally stopped, the world looked like another planet. Silence blanketed everything. Trees stood frozen like statues. Footsteps crunched on the surface like brittle glass. And sometimes, heartbreak lingered with the drifts. A door left ajar, a window broken, a name uncalled for. But those who made it through knew something deep in their bones: the storm would come again. And so would spring. They remembered each narrow escape, not with fear, but with reverence. Because to survive a blizzard was to look death in the eye and keep moving. It was to cling to rope lines, hold candles high, and trust that warmth waited on the other side of the cold. Even now, the tales are told. Of blizzards that swallowed whole valleys. Of boots frozen solid. Of children who braved the cold to save their families. Of mothers who sat by the fire through the night, praying and listening. Listening for the door to open. For boots on the step. For life returning. Those nights shaped them. And their stories still echo, softly, like wind over snowdrifts, reminding us of what it meant to endure. Spring didn't come with a bang. It crept in quietly, like a whisper after a long silence. One morning, the wind wasn't biting. Another, the icicles dripping from the eaves made tiny tapping sounds as they melted, like applause from the sky. After months of white and grey, a thin stream trickled under the snowbank, carving its way through frozen earth. That was the first sign, the creek was waking up. Inside the cabin, life was still slow, but the air felt different. Damp instead of dry. Lighter. Hopeful. Boots were still kept by the door, fire still burning low in the stove. But folks began to stretch, to breathe, like bears stirring in their dens. Out in the woods, birds began to sing again. Just a few at first, sparrows, maybe a lark, testing their voices. Their song was soft, not wanting to spook the snow into staying. Then came the scent of thawing mud. You'd only notice it if you were really paying attention, but it was there. Earth returning. Children pressed their faces to the windows, watching for the first rabbit tracks in slush. They'd learned patience in winter, but now their bodies ached to run. The moment the snow softened, out they went, still bundled up, still wet to the knees, but free at last. They splashed in puddles, poked at tree bark, and picked up sticks like treasure. Nothing fancy. Just movement. Just joy. For the adults, spring meant work, but not the kind that wore you down. It meant checking fences, mending roofs, opening smokehouses, and brushing off the dust from tools. Everything needed fixing. But somehow, it felt lighter under a blue sky. They opened shutters again, cracked the windows. Let in the sun. Food supplies were usually low by then. The cellar shelves, once packed in the fall, held only a few jars. A sack of beans. Maybe a strip or two of dried meat. But soon, wild greens would push up through the frost. And when that happened, oh, how sweet a bowl of greens could taste. The river, once sealed in ice, ran freely again, laughing over rocks and carrying bits of winter away. Sometimes families would walk down just to watch it move. After months of stillness, motion was a marvel. Even water seemed alive again. The graves from winter, if any had been dug, could now be tended. Flowers placed. Stones marked. The pain still fresh, but the world blooming anyway. Spring didn't erase grief. But it made space for it. Warmed it. Gave it somewhere to rest. The families who made it through the coldest nights didn't come out unchanged. They were leaner. Tired. Wiser. But also stronger, in ways they couldn't quite name. They'd learned things about themselves. About each other. About endurance and tenderness. About holding tight and letting go. They'd learned the rhythm of life in a hard land. The truth that nothing lasts forever, not the storms, not the silence, not even the sorrow. Everything shifts. Everything melts. Everything comes back around. And so, when the snow finally faded from the last corner of the yard, when the chickens started laying more eggs, and when that first dandelion popped its stubborn yellow head out of the soil, they smiled. No big celebrations. No shouting in the streets. Just a quiet moment by the fire, maybe a nod between husband and wife, or a whispered, "Thank you," before bed. The coldest nights had passed. But the lessons remained. They remained in the worn hands that chopped wood. In the child who now knew how to feed the fire. In the prayers still whispered at night, even after the storm was long gone. And they remained in the stories, told again each winter, passed down from rocking chairs, by candlelight, as the wind howled once more and the next generation listened. The frontier never promised ease. Only life. Hard and beautiful, simple and deep. And spring, every time, was its quiet reward.